The Misanthrope by J. D. Beresford. Since I have returned from the rock and discussed the story in all its bearings, I have begun to wonder if the man made a fool of me. In the deeps of my consciousness, I feel that he did not. Nevertheless, I cannot resist the effect of all the laughter that has been evoked by my narrative. Here on the mainland, the whole thing seems unlikely, grotesque, foolish. On the rock, the man's confession carried absolute conviction. The setting is everything, and I am perhaps thankful that my present circumstances are so beautifully conducive to sanity. No one appreciates the mystery of life more than I do, but when the mystery involves such a doubt of oneself, I find it pleasanter to forget. Naturally, I do not want to believe the story. If I did, I should know myself to be some kind of human horror. And the terror of it all lies in the fact that I may never know precisely what kind. Before I went, we had eliminated the facile and banal explanation that the man was mad, and had fallen back upon the two inevitable alternatives: crime and disappointed love. We were human and romantic, and we tried desperately hard not to be too obvious. Once before a man had made the same attempt, and had built or tried to build a house on the Gulland rock. But he had been defeated within a fortnight. What was left of his building was taken off the island and turned into a tin church. It is there still. We all went to Trevone, and ruminated over and round it, perhaps with some faint hope that one of us might, all unknowing, have the abilities of a psychometrist. Nothing came of that visit but a slight intensification of those theories that were already becoming a little stale. We compared the earlier failure of 30 years ago, the attempt that was baffled, with the present success. For this new misanthrope had lived on the Gulland through the whole winter, and still lived. Indeed, the fact of his presence on that awful lump of rock was now accepted by the country people. To them he was scarcely a shade madder than the other visitors, that remunerative, recurrent host that this year broke their journey to Bedrethen in order to stand on Trevone beach and stare foolishly at the just visible hut that stuck like a cubical gall on the landward face of that humped, desolate island. We all did that, stared at nothing in particular, and meditated enormously. But in what I felt at the time was a wild spirit of adventure, I went out one night to the point of Gunver Head, and saw an actual light within that distant hut, a patch of golden lichen on the mother parasite. Some aspect of humanity I found in that light it was, that finally decided me, that, and some quality of sympathy, perhaps with the hermit, mad, criminal, or lovelorn, who had found sanctuary from the pestilent touch of the encroaching crowd. It was in fact a wildish night, and I stayed until the little yellow speck went out, and all I could see through the murk was an occasional canopy of curving spray when the elbow of the Trevose light touched a bare corner of that black Gulland. The making of a decision was no difficult matter, but while I waited for the necessary calm that would permit the occasional boat to land provisions on the island 2 miles out from the mainland, I suffered qualms of doubt and nervousness, and I suffered them alone, for I had determined that no hint of my adventure should be given to any one of our party until the voyage had been made. They might think that I had gone fishing, an excuse which had all the air of probability given to it by the coming of the boatman to say that the tide and wind would serve that morning. I had warned and bribed him to give no clue to my friends of the goal of my proposed excursion. My nervousness suffered no decrease as we approached the rock and saw the authentic figure of its single inhabitant awaiting our arrival. I had some consolation in the thought that he would be in some way prepared by the sight of our surprisingly passengered boat, but my mind shuddered at the necessity for using some conventional form of address if I would make at once my introduction an excuse. The civilized opening was so hopelessly incapable of expressing my sympathy, presenting instead so unmistakably, it seemed to me, the single solution of common curiosity. I wondered that he had not, as the boatman so clearly assured me was the case, had other prying visitors before me. My self-consciousness increased as we came nearer to the single opening among the spiked rocks that served as a miniature harbour at half-tide. I felt that I was being watched by the man who now stood awaiting us at the water's edge. Suddenly my spirit broke. I decided that I could not force myself upon him, that I would remain in the boat while its cargo was delivered, and then return with the boatman to Travone. So resolute was I in this plan that when we had pulled into the tiny landing place, I kept my gaze steadfastly averted from the man I had come to see, and stared solemnly out at the humped back of Trevose, seen now in an entirely new aspect. The sound of the hermit's voice startled me from a perfectly genuine abstraction. "Fairly decent weather today," he remarked, with, I thought, a touch of nervousness. He had, I remembered, addressed the same remark to the boatmen, who were now conveying their cargo up to the hut. I looked up and met his stare. He was indeed regarding me with a curious effect of concentration, as if he were eager to note every detail of my expression. "Jolly," I replied. "Been pretty beastly the last day or two. Kept you rather short, hasn't it?" "I make allowances for that," he said. "Keep a reserve, you know. Are you staying over there?" He nodded towards the bay. "For a week or two," I told him, and we began to discuss the country around Harlyn with the eagerness of two strangers who find a common topic at a dull reception. "Never been on the Gulland before, I suppose?" he ventured at last, when the boatmen had discharged their load and were evidently ready to be off. No, I haven't," I said, and hesitated. I felt that the invitation must come from him. He boggled over it by saying, "Dashed awkward place to get to, and nothing to see, of course. I don't know if you're at all keen on fishing." "Rather," I said with enthusiasm. "There's deep water on the other side of the rock," he went on. "In the right weather you get splendid bass there." He stopped, and then added, "It'll be absolutely top hole for 'em this afternoon." "Perhaps I could come back," I began, but the boatman interrupted me at once. "You can come back tomorrow, sure enough," he said. "Tide only serves once every 12 hours. "If you'd care to stay now," began the hermit. "Thanks, that's awfully good of you. I should like to, of all things," I said. I stayed on the clear understanding that the boatmen were to fetch me the next morning. At first there was really very little that seemed in any way strange about the man on the Gulland. His name, he told me, was William Copley, but it appeared that he was no relation to the Copleys I knew, and if he had shaved, he would have looked a very ordinary type of Englishman, roughing it on a holiday. His age I judged to be between 30 and 40. Only two things about him struck me as a little queer during our very successful afternoon's fishing. The first was that intense, appraising stare of his, as if he tried to fathom the very depths of one's being. The second was an inexplicable devotion to one particular form of ceremony. As our intimacy grew, he dropped the ordinary formal politeness of a host, but he insisted always on one observance that I supposed at first to be the merely conventional business of giving precedence. Nothing would induce him to go in front of me. He sent me ahead even as we explored the little purlieus of his rock. The only level square yard on the whole island was in the floor of the hut, but presently I noticed that this peculiarity went still further, and that he would not turn his back on me for a single moment. That discovery intrigued one. I still excluded the explanation of madness. Copley's manner and conversation were so convincingly sane. But I reverted to and elaborated those other two suggestions that had been made. I could not avoid the inference that the man must in some strange way be afraid of me, and I hesitated as to whether he were flying from some form of justice, or from revenge, perhaps a vendetta. Either theory seemed to account for his intense, appraising stare. I inferred that his longing for companionship had grown so strong that he had determined to risk the possibility of my being an emissary sent by some, to me, exquisitely romantic person or persons who desired Copley's death. I recalled and wallowed in some of the marvellous imaginings of the novelist. I wondered if I could make Copley speak by convincing him of my innocent identity. How I thrilled at the prospect. But the explanation of it all came without any effort on my part. He sent me out of the hut while he prepared our supper. Quite a magnificent meal, by the way. I saw his reason at once. He could not manage all that business of cooking and laying the table without turning his back on me. One thing, however, puzzled me a little. He drew down the blind of the little square window as soon as I had gone outside. Naturally, I made no demur. I climbed down to the edge of the sea. It was a glorious evening, and waited until he called me. He stood at the door of the hut until I was within a few feet of him, and then retreated into the room and sat down with his back to the wall. We discussed our afternoon's sport as we had supper, but when we had finished and our pipes were going, he said suddenly, "I don't see why I shouldn't tell you." Like a fool, I agreed eagerly, when I might so easily have stopped him. "It began when I was quite a kid," he said. "My mother found me crying in the garden, and all I could tell her was that Claude, my elder brother, looked horrid. I couldn't bear the sight of him for days afterwards either, but I was such a perfectly normal child that they weren't seriously perturbed about this one idiosyncrasy of mine. They thought that Claude had made a face at me and frightened me. My father whacked me for it eventually. Perhaps that whacking stuck in my mind. Anyway, I didn't confide my peculiarity to anyone until I was nearly 17. I was ashamed of it, of course. I am still, in a way." He stopped and looked down, pushed his plate away from him, and folded his arms on the table. I was pining to ask a question, but I was afraid to interrupt, and after a moment's hesitation, he looked up and held my gaze again, but now without that inquiring look of his. Rather, he seemed to be looking for sympathy. "I told my housemaster," he said. He was a splendid chap, and he was very decent about it, took it all quite seriously, and advised me to consult an oculist, which I did. I went in the holidays with the pater. I had given him a more reasonable account of my trouble, and he took me to the best man in London. He was tremendously interested, and it proves that there must be something in it, that it can't be imagination, because he really found a defect in my eyes, something quite new to him, he said. He called it a new form of astigmatism, but of course, as he pointed out, no glasses would be any use to me. "But what?" I began, unable to keep down my curiosity any longer. Copley hesitated and dropped his eyes. "Astigmatism, you know," he said, "is a defect. I quote the dictionary. I learned that definition by heart. I often puzzle over it still. Causing images of lines having a certain direction to be indistinctly seen, while those of lines transverse to the former are distinctly seen. Only mine is peculiar in the fact that my sight is perfectly normal, except when I look back at anyone over my shoulder." He looked up almost pathetically. I could see that he hoped I might understand without further explanation. But I had to confess myself utterly mystified. What had this trifling defect of vision to do with his coming to live on the Gulland, I wondered. I frowned my perplexity. "But I don't see," I said. He knocked out his pipe and began to scrape the bowl with his pocket-knife. "Well, mine is a kind of moral astigmatism, too," he said. "At least, it gives me a kind of moral insight. I'm afraid I must call it insight. I've proved in some cases that—" He dropped his voice. He was apparently deeply engrossed in the scraping out of his pipe. He kept his eyes on it as he continued. "Normally, you understand, when I look at people straight in the face, I see them as anybody else sees them. But when I look back at them over my shoulder, I see all their vices and defects. Their faces remain, in a sense, the same, perfectly recognizable, I mean, but distorted, beastly. There was my brother, Claude. Good-looking chap he was, but when I saw him that way, he had a nose like a parrot, and he looked sort of weakly voracious, vicious." He stopped and shuddered slightly, and then added, "One knows now that he is like that too. He's just been hammered on the stock exchange. Rotten sort of failure it was. And then Dennison, my housemaster, you know, such a decent chap. I never looked at him that way until the end of my last term at school. I had got into the habit, more or less, of never looking over my shoulder, you see, but I was always getting caught. That was an instance. I was playing for the school against the old boys. Dennison called out, 'Good luck, old chap,' just as I was going in, and I forgot and looked back at him. I waited, breathless, and as he did not go on, I prompted him with, 'Was he wrong, too?' Copley nodded. Weak. Poor devil. His eyes were all right, but they were fighting his mouth, if you know what I mean. There would have been an awful scandal at the school there, 4 years after I left, if they hadn't hushed it up and got Dennison out of the country. Well, then, if you want any more instances, there was the oculist. Big fine chap he was. Of course, he made me look at him over my shoulder to test me. He asked me what I saw, and I told, more or less. He went simply livid for a moment. He was a sensualist, you see. And when I saw him that way, he looked like some filthy old hog. The thing that really finished me, he went on, after a long interval, was the breaking off of my engagement to Helen. We were frightfully in love with one another, and I told her about my trouble. She was very sympathetic, and I suppose rather sentimentally romantic, too. She believed it was some sort of spell that had been put on me. I think, anyway, she had a theory that if I once saw anybody truly and ordinarily over my shoulder, I should never have any more trouble. The spell would be broken, sort of thing. And of course, she wanted to be the person. I didn't resist her much. I was infatuated, I suppose. Anyway, I thought she was perfection, and that it was simply impossible that I could find any defect in her. So I agreed, and looked that way. His voice had fallen to an even note of despondency, as though the telling of this final tragedy in his life had brought him to the indifference of despair. I looked, he continued, and saw a creature with no chin and watery, doting eyes, a faithful, slobbery thing. Ugh. I can't. I never spoke to her again. That broke me, you know, he said presently. After that, I didn't care. I used to look at everyone that way, until I had to get away from humanity. I was living in a world of beasts. Most of them looked like some beast or bird or other. The strong were vicious and criminal, and the weak were loathsome. I couldn't stick it. In the end, I had to come here, away from them all. A thought occurred to me. Have you ever looked at yourself in the glass? I asked. He nodded. I'm no better than the rest of them, he said. That's why I grew this rotten beard. I haven't got a looking glass here. And you can't keep a stiff neck, as it were, I asked, going about looking humanity straight in the face. The temptation is too strong, Copley said, and it gets stronger. Curiosity, partly, I suppose, but partly it's the momentary sense of superiority it gives you. You see them like that, you know, and forget how you look yourself. And then after a bit, it sickens you. You haven't, I said, and hesitated. I wanted to know, and yet I was horribly afraid. You haven't, I began again. You haven't, looked at me yet? That way? Not yet, he said. Do you suppose? Probably. You look all right, of course, but then so did heaps of the others. You've no idea how I should look to you that way. Absolutely none. I've been trying to guess, but I can't. You wouldn't care. Not now, he said sharply. Perhaps just before you go. You feel fairly certain, then? He nodded with disgusting conviction. I went to bed wondering whether Helen's theory wasn't a true one, and if I might not break the spell for poor Copley. The boatman came for me soon after 11 next morning. I had shaken off some of the feeling of superstitious horror that had held me overnight, and I had not repeated my request to Copley, nor had he offered to look into the dark places of my soul. He came down after me to the landing place, and we shook hands warmly, but he said nothing about my revisiting him. And then, just as we were putting off, he turned back towards the hut and looked at me over his shoulder. Just one quick glance. "Wait," I commanded the boatman, and I stood up and called to him. "I say, Copley," I shouted. He turned and looked at me, and I saw that his face was transfigured. He wore an expression of foolish disgust and loathing. I had seen something like it on the face of an idiot child who was just going to be sick. I dropped down into the boat and turned my back on him. I wondered then if that was how he had seen himself in the glass. But since, I have only wondered what it was he saw in me. And I can never go back to ask him. The Little Town by J.D. Beresford. It is quite a small place. That was all the information I could obtain. I had been referred to the omniscient Joe Shepperton, and this was all he could tell me. St. Earth, he had said, in Cornwall, and when I had explained that this was another St. Earth, he said, "Oh, quite a small place." Probably he had never before heard of it. As I looked out into the darkness and tried to dodge the reflection of my own face in the window, it seemed that we were passing through country of a kind which was quite unfamiliar to me. I had a vision of mountains and the broad roll of great forests, an effect that may have been produced by clouds. The yellow-lighted reflection of the now familiar interior jutted out before me, its floor diaphanous and traversed by 2 streaks of shining metal, and my own white face peered in at me with strained, searching eyes, frowning at me when our glances met, trying to peer past me into the light and warmth of the railway carriage. Once we crossed an interminable bridge that roared a sonorous resentment against our passage. I could not explain that bridge. We were not near the sea, and no English river could surely have been so wide. Yet the bridge was not a viaduct, for I caught the gleam of water below, some reflection of paler shadows from the lift of the sky. This adventure into unknown country was immensely exciting. It was discovery. I gave up my strained inquiry into the world beyond and let my imagination wander out into mystery. I was in the midst of high romance when the magnificent energy of our triumphant speed was checked by the sickening grind of the brake. The little station was a terminus, one forsaken, gloomy platform that stretched a grey finger into the night out of which we had come. I tried to see what was on the further side, across the metals, but beyond was a black void. I received the impression that I was on an immense height, that the dimly seen low stone wall was the parapet of some awful abyss. I could form no idea of the town during my minute's walk from the station to the rooms I had engaged. The whole place seemed to be very ill-lighted. All I could see was that it hung on the side of a hill. I went out when I had something to eat. It was only a few minutes past 8, and I was eager for adventure. I told my landlady that I was going down into the town to explore. "It's very dark," she said, with a note of warning in her voice. The street in which I was staying dipped gently towards the town, but as I went on, the dip became more pronounced. I congratulated myself on the fact that there would be no difficulty in finding my way back. The lie of the land would direct me. I had merely to ascend again. My street was longer than I had expected. At first there were houses on one side only, but further down the roadway narrowed, and there were houses on each side. I classified my lodgings as being in a sort of suburb grown up round the railway station, which was detached for obvious reasons, No railway but a funicular could have been carried down that hill. I came to the bottom of the street at last, and found another narrow street running across, right and left. Opposite to me, an alley continued the descent in nearly a straight line. Far below, a dim lamp was burning. I decided to keep straight on and plunged down the alley. It was interminably long. At the lamp it twisted suddenly, but still descended the hill. The place is bigger than I thought, was my reflection. I saw, however, that as the road continually fell before me, I must be keeping a right line. The town was not deserted. There were movements and the sound of voices all about me. Figures loomed up out of the darkness to meet me and clattered past over the rough cobbles. I heard laughter too, and whisperings in the dim black recesses of courts and doorways. Once or twice I caught the tinkle of some thin, high music far away in the distance. Elsewhere, I was conscious of the stir and struggle of life, of unseen creatures as careless of my presence as I of theirs. And still I had not come as yet to the town itself. I had pictured to myself some wider streets or open market, a place of lighted shops and visible life. I began to wonder if I had not passed by this imagined centre. I became a trifle impatient. I hurried on, down, always down, through the wriggling maze of tiny narrow alleys and passageways, lighted only by an occasional flickering lamp bracketed out from some corner house. A small place indeed, I said to myself. It is an enormous place. I received the impression that I might walk on forever through that tedious ravel of streets. Yet I knew that I could not be walking in a circle. I was always descending. I gave no thought now to the long toil of my return up the mountain. Already I thought of it as a mountain. I felt that I must and would reach the bottom. It was not what I had expected to find, yet the reality when I came upon it was so inevitable that I believed it to be the thing I had always anticipated. I turned at last out of a passage so narrow that my body brushed the wall on either side, into a small square of low houses, and the floor of the square was flat. On all sides it was entered by passages such as that from which I had just emerged, and all of them led upwards. About and above me I could vaguely distinguish an infinite slope of houses, ranging up tier above tier, lost at last in the black immensity. I appeared to be at the bottom of some titanic basin among the mountains, at the centre of some inconceivably vast collection of mean houses that swarmed over the whole face of visible earth. There is surely no other place like it in the world, I said to myself in wonder. There was a light in the square, 2 lamps that flanked an open door. Above the door was a faded sign. I guessed the place to be a hall of entertainment, probably a picture palace. I walked over to it and read the sign. It bore the one word, Cosmos. Some charlatan, I decided. No one was taking money at the door, and after a moment's hesitation, I went in. It was a queer little hall. The bareness of the walls was partly hidden by pathetic attempts at decoration. Some red material was rudely draped over the raw brickwork, and a few unframed dingy canvases, the subjects indistinguishable, were hung on this background. At the end was a rough proscenium opening, and behind it a stage that appeared to me quite brilliantly lighted after my long sojourn in the darkness. In the body of the hall, some 20 persons were seated on rough benches, staring at the still unoccupied stage. I found a seat near the door and waited. It came to me that the stage was disproportionately large for the size of the hall. And then, out of the wings, came wobbling a tiny figure. And I realized that this great stage was set for a puppet show. The whole thing was so impossibly grotesque that I nearly laughed aloud. Presently I turned my attention for a moment to the vague forms sitting round me, some of them silhouetted against the light of the stage, but none of them returned my stare. Rustics, I thought, with a touch of contempt. Men and women of such small intelligence and narrow experience that even such an amateur show as this amuses them. I turned back to the performance, though the foolishness of the doll's actions was beneath criticism. Nevertheless, after a time, a certain fascinated interest began to grow upon me, and I watched the performance, chafing at its slowness, with increasing attention. I tried to disentangle some meaning, some story, some purpose from the apparently aimless movements of these tiny dolls staggering about their gigantic setting. Every now and again I thought that I understood, that there was an indication of some sequence of action, some development of a theme. But always the leading figures wavered or fell at the actual moment, and chaos followed. Just a hopeless, maddening jumble. One piece of management, however, deserved and received my approbation. I had never, in any marionette show I have ever witnessed, seen the suspending wires so cleverly concealed. Stare and criticize as I would, I could see no sign of any mechanism whereby the dolls were supported and animated. This did indeed give me a curious sense of reality. It made me feel that these poor, ridiculous little figures had a sentient life of their own. Then some senseless action or helpless collapse reminded me of the invisible wires, and my pity for the feeble dolls was turned to contempt for the ineptitude of the operator. Dwelling on that ineptitude, I began to lose my temper, and I became conscious that other members of the audience were being similarly affected. I heard impatient sighs and half-suppressed groans of despair when some doll attempted to strut across the stage and collapsed halfway. I looked round me again and saw that men were twitching their arms, hands and ringers, leaning this way and that, as if to influence the movement of the dolls, just as a man will strain and grimace in order to influence the run of a ball over which he has no sort of control. I discovered that I had been unconsciously making the same foolish movements, and also that our attempted directions were not concerted. There was no unison, no characteristic sway in this direction or that. It was plain that we wished to influence the dolls in contradictory ways. But one feeling, I am convinced, animated us all. We were unanimously and angrily critical of the unseen operator. We were all convinced that we could work the unseen wires far more efficiently than that bungling performer. Indeed, the fact, so far as I was concerned, seemed clearly demonstrable. The actions of the dolls were so infantile, so contemptibly purposeless. That obsession grew upon me. The mismanagement of the whole stupid affair began to appear of quite transcendent importance. I could not watch without striving to help, and I was forced to watch. The performance closed abruptly. The curtain descended without notice, apparently in the middle of the play, unheralded by any grouping or arrangement which might suggest finale. The audience, almost in darkness, were left to stumble out as best they could. I could not find the exit, and when I did find a door, it was not the right one. It opened onto a flight of steep, narrow stairs. It occurred to me that this must be the way up into the flies, to the place in which the operator sat and controlled his dolls. In a sudden mood of determination, I decided to seek him out. I would give him some primitive instruction. He must be some ignorant countryman. I would give him a few useful hints in the conduct of his business. Suggest a story for his dolls to act, some sequent, purposeful story moving towards a climax. I stumbled upwards in the dark, one hand on the cold, rough wall, the other stretched out before me to guard against any obstacle which might be in my path. It was a very long staircase, for the proscenium opening was a high one. When I was nearly at the top, the stairway twisted unexpectedly. I found myself looking down on the still brilliantly lighted stage. Before me, in a great chair that was almost a throne, an old man sat, gazing tenderly down upon the stage below him. There was a calm, gentle wisdom upon his face, and he moved his hands slowly, this way and that. I looked down and saw that, although the curtain had fallen and the hall was empty, the performance was still going on, in the same aimless, inexplicable manner. Perhaps the old man was practicing his art, or perhaps he did not know that the curtain had fallen and the audience gone away. In any case, he sat there with a sweet, intent smile, passing his outspread hands slowly to and fro over the heads of those foolish, inept figures beneath. And even then, I could see no wires, no connection between those mesmeric hands and the tottering figures. A strange diffidence had come over me. From where I stood, it appeared an immensely difficult task to control and guide the movements of those below. My anxiety to instruct died out of me. I began to marvel at the dexterity with which the old man would sometimes raise a falling doll by the lift of his little finger. And from my new point of view, I thought I could at least discern some purpose in the play. For a time I stood motionless, watching, and then I looked again at the operator, seated in his great chair. He was quite unconscious of my presence. He wore always the same serene, gentle smile. He was in no way perturbed when his dolls stumbled and fell. He sat serene, intent, and his hand moved ceaselessly to and fro over the great stage. I crept away softly and found my way out. When I reached the square again, the moon had risen. I looked up and saw the little railway station a few 100 yards away. It was a stiff climb, but I reached home in 10 minutes. The town was, after all, quite a small place. In the morning, I wondered whether the old man still sat in the same place, manipulating his dolls. I wondered whether he was a charlatan, or only very old and very, very foolish. (1912) Today's stories were The Misanthrope and The Little Town by J. D. Beresford. They were read by Jasper L'Estrange. Well, I I do hope you enjoyed them. And until next time, sweet dreams.